So I'm here tonight to talk briefly about what I see as the project of America, which is the fight against corruption. We have a total crisis in this state and a total crisis in this country of corruption. But I believe if you go back to the best part of the founding generation, you'll see that this country was founded as an anti-corruption country. At the Constitutional Convention, you know what they talked about more than violence? More than Shays' Rebellion? More than factions, which you might have learned about in your poli-sci class as the great obsession of the founding generation. They talked about corruption. You can see in longhand the word corrupt, corruption, bribe, corrupting, over and over again. And Benjamin Franklin was so focused on corruption that as the oldest representative to the Constitutional Convention, he wrote out his speech, which he thought was the most important thing, to have somebody else read out loud, just in case he got it written, he wouldn't read it right, to say, we have to protect, we have to build a system that protects against people going into public office for private gain, and people going into public office to be servants, to be placemen of the wealthy and the elites. I love it that Franklin did that because he was known as a corrupt old fox, the most corrupt of all corrupt men. But because of his years and years of experience in Europe and the United States, he was especially vigilant. After the Constitutional Convention, George Mason said, if we don't protect against corruption, we will soon be at an end. And Hamilton, who's undergoing a revival now, our own Hamilton, described the Constitutional Convention as we erected every practicable obstacle against corruption. So if you see the Constitution as a document, as an anti-corruption document, that is our project. It's not our project just because of what's happening in Albany. It's not our project just because of what happened after Watergate. It is the work of our country to build systems that allow representatives to serve the public good instead of private ends. And the founders weren't naive. They were hard-bitten realists. I'm not naive. I've been bitten. But that what they understood that is so fundamental is all of us carry within ourselves the potential to be selfish. We all carry within ourselves the potential to be beggars and servants. But we also carry within ourselves the possibility of loving the public and waking up in the middle of the night or working in the middle of the day for the public at large. And so the job of writing a constitution and our ongoing job as Americans is to build systems and structures that make it just a little bit more likely that when you wake up as a senator, as a representative, as a governor, you think, how can I serve the public instead of how can I serve a few wealthy interests? That's our job. That's our project. There's some wonderful stories, historical stories. My book is very small. If it was actually the history of corruption in America, it would be much bigger. But it's a history of what corruption has meant in American law. And I just want to tell you one that I love. It's like, after having founded this country as an anti-corruption country, figuring out what corruption means is actually kind of tricky. So one of the early cases that came up involved the Yazoo land scandal. These are lands in western Georgia that a bunch of land speculators came to the Georgia legislature and said, we want to buy that land. It looks very attractive. And the Georgia legislature said no, so they bought all the legislators, all the lawmakers. They gave them all cash, all but one, all cash or stock in the company that wanted to buy the land. The legislature passed the land sale. The governor vetoed it, so the speculators went back to the governor, bought him, passed it, went through the veto. This was called the real estate deal of the millennium. It was a scandal that was talked about for 30 years in the press, the Yazoo Scandal. You were defined by whether you were pro-Yazoo or anti-Yazoo. The question in the case then, and then the people of Georgia did what we all do when we feel like our government has been corrupt. Voted out every single Georgia lawmaker. And then, just in case you weren't sure about how they felt about it, they had a bonfire and burned the law that gave away the lands. So this ended up being a really tricky case because the question is, was that law that gave away these millions of acres so corrupt that it wasn't a good law? Do we just void it? Or tough luck, if the land is sold, Georgia, go on your way. So this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court and is decided by Justice Marshall, himself a land speculator. And you might remember this case, it's very famous because it's the only case in which an advocate had to sober up and take time between oral arguments before finishing his argument. That was the advocate for the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia lost. And Justice Marshall said, it's too hard to figure out what corruption is. I guess I can't say whether this bill is corrupt or another bill is corrupt, so people of Georgia, you're out of luck. That case really made Jefferson mad. He called it one of the twistifications of Justice Marshall. What are we going to do? But with exceptions like that case, what you see is for 200 years a pretty consistent idea that the job of courts and the job of state houses and the job of Congress was to protect against corruption with extraordinary vigilance because there's a constant threat. I almost think of democracy as a kind of whack-a-mole. There's always a threat. It's going to come from different places. There's no steady state. And so our job as Americans, as small d Democrats, is to erect different barriers at different times to allow for our lawmakers to freely serve the public and the public good. That sense of what corruption means started to really fall apart in the 70s. 1976 was Buckley versus Vallejo, the first case that sort of put a dent into our traditional understanding of corruption. And you start to see the rise of this phrase, which you may know, quid pro quo, right? Have you heard that phrase? Don't you feel smart when you say it? It's Latin, right? It feels like it has these firm, rigid edges. Well, quid pro quo was not part of the law of corruption until the 70s. It comes from contract law. Quid pro quo, relative equality of exchange. And it doesn't, even though it sounds solid and the Supreme Court likes to use it, it doesn't actually help with these making definitions of corruption that easy. In fact, the Sixth Circuit has quipping, citing The Godfather, not all quids are made of the same stuff. Quid pro quo has become a stand-in in our Supreme Court for a really nonsensical idea that something isn't corrupt unless it's explicit. Basically, it's only corrupt if you're the Keystone Cops. What the Supreme Court has said effectively is if you don't make a deal, I will give you this $106,000 donation for that carried interest loophole. If you don't say that, it's not corrupt. Winks and nods don't count as corruption. Influence doesn't count as corruption. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any common sense. And it explains both Citizens United and McCutcheon versus FEC is this totally cramped, abstract understanding of corruption. So what do? This is American history in 60 seconds. One, I think the essential thing we do is pass public financing of elections because otherwise lawmakers cannot be free. Right now, members of Congress spend 30 to 70% of their time calling the wealthiest people whose names they can find and asking them for $2,000 to $5,000 donations. That is the job description of our congressional representatives. Until we have public financing, our Congress members can't work on watershed, flooding, energy, jobs, infrastructure, all the things that are all really hard, but should be the job of our lawmakers. Instead, they're working not necessarily for their own financial gain, but for the gain of their donors. Here in New York, we have a lot of things we could do. We have a crime wave of corruption in Albany. I don't know if you've noticed. 2 out of 3 of the 3 men in the room are going to be sentenced in the next month. The last man in the room just pushed forward a budget that has 0 ethics reforms, 0 response to the crime wave of corruption that we have right here. There was a poll today, but I don't think you need the poll, you just talk to humans, that said that 48% of New Yorkers want all elected officials thrown out until we can get people who care about serious ethics reform here in New York State. So maybe we're coming across a Yazoo moment in Albany. Maybe we'll start to see the bills burned and the elected officials thrown out, unless the executive branch starts pushing through serious closing of the LLC loophole, public financing elections, and changing the way campaigns are funded in this state. Thank you.